Hello, I'm Hala Mahudin, and this is Counting the Costs on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, internal conflicts, border and water disputes. Ethiopia's challenges are piling up, with even the United States calling on international lenders to block access to finances. Is Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed up for the political and economic challenges? One of the biggest exporters of emissions wants to drill in the Arctic, but environmentalists are challenging Norway's plans in the European courts. And the pandemic has decimated the tourism and leisure industry. We find out how one island nation is hoping and planning for the recovery. For much of the past 2 decades, Ethiopia's economy, with the odd exception, has grown at a breakneck 10% or more. That is, until the arrival of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in 2018. Now, he had hoped to lift the economy to middle-income status through privatisation, but conflicts in the northern Tigray region, the pandemic and locust swarms have strained the country's finances. Now, for a popular Prime Minister who won the Nobel Peace Prize for ending a border war with neighbouring Eritrea, the challenges are adding up. Its forces have been routed in Tigray before plunging the region into a humanitarian crisis. The United Nations says 70% of the population needs food aid. Now, that conflict flowed from Abiy's decision to lift bans on opposition and rebel groups, which has stoked long-held ethnic tensions and rivalries. Communal fighting in Amhara and Oromia has left hundreds dead. Tensions are brewing on the border with Sudan over disputed farming land. Geopolitical tensions are also rising between Egypt, Sudan and Ethiopia over Abiy's decision to continue filling a vast dam on the Nile. Cairo and Khartoum fear water diverted to fill the $4.5 billion dam will cause droughts, as Sudan experienced last year. Despite all the challenges at home and abroad, Abiy won last month's election, winning 410 of the 436 seats that were up for grabs. Opposition groups have accused his party of vote rigging, intimidating and harassing its opponents. But there are doubts Abiy can deal with all the challenges Ethiopia faces. It's that conflict in Tigray that earned the wrath of Washington, which imposed sanctions on the country. The United States provided $1 billion in funding in 2020, but crucially, it's told the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to withhold funding. That could prove problematic as the country tries to renegotiate its debts. It's not just governments and international bodies that are thinking twice about investing in Ethiopia. Foreign direct investments or business investment slumped to $2.4 billion last year from a high of $4.2 billion in 2017. Its currency has slumped 12% against the dollar this year, and an economy may grow just 2% this year, after an average of almost 10% over the last decade, according to the IMF. Now, we mentioned how Ethiopia's Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam project has strained ties with Egypt and Sudan, but for Ethiopians, it's a source of pride. Many have contributed millions of dollars to the project by buying bonds. And as Catherine Soy reports from Mizraki in Ethiopia, they're looking forward to how it will change their lives.
Tejnesh Gerome shows us all she's ever used to light up her house, a bottle kerosene lamp. She lives in a village 2 hours drive north of Addis Ababa.
We have many health problems. We spend more time than we should in hospitals, and I think it's linked to this lamp.
Next door, her brother-in-law is using solar energy, but only he and a few others here can afford it.
Women travel far with their donkeys to get the most basic support. If we had electricity in our village, then they wouldn't have to go far to grind maize, for example.
Up to 65 million Ethiopians, that's more than half the population, are not connected to the electricity grid. Many have bought government bonds for the construction of the Grand Renaissance Dam, Africa's largest hydroelectric dam. About 250 Ethiopians live in this village. They're poor farmers who raised $1,500 for the construction of the dam. They're passionate about the project and eagerly waiting to be connected to the grid. Ethiopia has started filling the dam for a second time, and this is causing unease downstream. Egypt and Sudan are worried about how it could affect their own water flows. The two countries want a binding agreement governing how the dam will be operated. Talks mediated by the African Union have failed. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed recently told Parliament the project will not stop.
Ethiopia does not intend to arm other countries. Our intention is to work with other countries and improve our status.
Moses Atemu is worried about the tensions. He has invested about $2 million in expanding his oxygen and nitrogen energy plant in anticipation of more reliable electricity. His factory, which supplies oxygen to all of eastern Ethiopia, is facing daily unpredictable power cuts.
For Ethiopia is life and death, because without electricity, enough electricity, this country cannot progress at all. So, being such important commodity for us, we are contributing willingly from our pocket.
With or without an agreement, the completion of the dam is imminent. And Ethiopians like Tishome Tidese, his family and neighbors back in Misraki village are preparing for what it may bring.
Right, let's get some analysis now with Louw Nel, a senior political analyst with Cape Town-based NKC African Economics. Great to have you with us on Counting the Costs. Now, Ethiopia has requested that its debt be restructured under G20 plans to help countries deal with the pandemic. Now, does Washington's call on the IMF and the World Bank to withhold funding complicate matters at all?
Certainly, but it needs to be said that matters are already quite complicated. The debt service suspension initiative is set to expire at the end of the year, and Ethiopia approached the G20 for debt treatment under the common framework in January. But there has been very little in terms of progress since then. And that is, of course, causing a great deal of anxiety as the initiative is set to expire. Ethiopia's debt is significant. The country owes an estimated 54 billion, which is about 67% of GDP, of which almost 30 is external. The slow progress is most likely contributed towards Moody's decision to downgrade the country in May and place its credit rating on review. And we saw a rather exasperated statement from the IMF on July 6th when it said it strongly encourages the swift formation of a creditor committee. What exactly is holding up the negotiations? It's possible that it has to do with US pressure, but it also seems that there is some exasperation from some of the creditors, some frustration around transparency issues. It seems that Ethiopia is reluctant to open its books, and this could have a number of reasons why. The cost of the war in Tigray being one of those. It's loans with China being another, but it is certainly complicating a process that is already problematic.
Well, it's a problematic situation. It's a complicated situation. But given the debt to GDP ratio that you've just quoted, would you say that Ethiopia's finances are in a critical position right now?
Yes, I would suggest that their public finances is not a healthy one currently. We saw estimates most recently of the war in Tigray costing as much as $2.5 billion. Now that puts an enormous hole in any country's public finances. Then add to these sort of idiosyncratic risks that will deter FDI and will threaten donor support. That's another major consideration for Ethiopia. Ethiopia is one of the largest recipients of aid in Africa, and the US alone contributed some $1 billion to that in 2020. This is very much under threat, and is one of the significant leverages that the US has over Ethiopia. So the Addis Ababa would have been very annoyed by comments made last year by President Joe Biden and specifically by US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. His comments, particularly to Congress, where he described the situation in Tigray amounting to ethnic cleansing, would have rankled them a great deal. But it is these targeted sanctions against individuals and the restrictions placed on economic and security assistance that will hurt the most.
Quite. Well, let's bring the focus now on to Prime Minister Abiy. Now, he has won a strong mandate in last month's elections. Do you think he will be able to achieve his goal of lifting the country up to middle income status, or do you think the pandemic has just erased that prospect entirely?
Yes, the pandemic is of course a major threat to Mr. Abiy's new administration, which should be sworn in October. He's won an enormous, overwhelming mandate. There are some suggestions in places that that he won almost too many votes. In Addis Ababa specifically, the opposition failed to win any votes. When opposition candidate won one of the seats there, and the Prosperity Party won everything else. That strong mandate comes with enormous challenges. The pandemic, the situation in Tigray is perhaps the biggest threat, really. We are seeing movements of soldiers, mobilization taking place in Amhara, regional security forces to go meet TPLF advances in the west of the region. TPLF seemingly has captured most of the north and south of Tigray. So there's the conflict situation that he has to deal with. I could have mentioned this earlier as well, is that Ethiopia's privatization drive, its much vaunted privatization drive, also faces significant risks now. The bid for spectrum in April of this year only attracted 2 bidders, and at least part of that can be explained by the fact that investing in Ethiopia right now comes with very significant reputational risk. And your US and EU-based companies will be reluctant to submit bids for massive investments like that, considering its country stance at the moment.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you touched on the privatisation, because that is one of Abiy's signature policies. Another one of his real policy drives is the Grand Renaissance Dam project. And that, of course, is causing a lot of tension amongst Ethiopia's neighbours. What do you make of this? How does this feed into the economic picture? And is this another potential flashpoint for conflict?
So before I move on to the good, I should point out that there's another leverage that the US is seemingly interested in using against Ethiopia, and that is the successful Safaricom bid that was awarded in May of this year. Quite a large part of that consortium was made up of the US International Development Finance Corporation. It involves a $500 million loan, which now seems to be in the balance. A lot of this US pressure being placed on Ethiopia is certainly not good news for the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam agreement, tripartite agreement with Sudan and Egypt. The US, of course, is a very close partner to Egypt, and there's a perception that they are favoring Egypt in these negotiations. And the Ethiopian-US relationship is being tainted on so many grounds. And it's one of the reasons why Ethiopia is insisting that negotiations take place under the auspices of the African Union. The threat for conflict cannot be dismissed, but it needs to be said that conflict between Ethiopia and Egypt is very difficult to imagine just because of the sheer geographic divide, the massive distance between those two countries. So in essence, Sudan would have to involve itself in any such conflict. They would have to provide Egypt support and allow them to use their territory. We're getting well ahead of ourselves, of course, by talking about such a conflict, but that is a consideration. And Sudan, on some level at least, recognizes the advantage of having a massive hydroelectric project on its doorstep that it could potentially benefit from in the future for its electricity needs. So they would be reluctant, I think, to have the situation escalate and get too far out of hand.
Okay, fascinating insights from you, Louw Nel. Really appreciate you talking to us here on Counting the Cost. That's Louw Nel from NKC Economics. Thank you.
Most welcome. Thank you.
Norway has done a lot to curtail its emissions, with consumers buying more electric than conventional cars. But Western Europe's biggest exporter of oil is also one of the world's biggest exporters of emissions. And not content with plans for seabed mining, it's also planning to drill for oil in the Arctic, but not if environmentalists have their way. Emboldened by victories in courts against Royal Dutch Shell and the German government, activists are pushing a European court to rule that Norway's drilling is a breach of human rights. In 3 previous cases, Norwegian courts have found the government has not breached those rights. Well, let's talk now to one of the activists bringing that case. Joining us via Skype from Melbourne, Australia, is Sam Cossar-Gilbert, a campaigner for economic justice at Friends of the Earth International. Could you just start by explaining to us why you're bringing this case? What are the grounds for pursuing this legal action?
So what we know from these cases and a lot of the climate cases in general, what we need to prove is that climate change causes a breach of human rights and that exploiting new fossil fuels also leads directly to climate change. We think that there's much new evidence coming out in terms of climate change. We see that the impacts of climate change are getting worse and worse. I'm from Australia, and just last year we saw massive bushfires destroying an area the size of France. We're currently seeing heat waves in North America and also floods throughout the world. So the evidence is mounting about the impact of climate change. We've also seen a number of very significant victories by young people in regards to climate litigation. So the German case is very telling, in which a group of young people in Germany were able to win on these human rights climate grounds. Also, we were able to win Friends of the Earth against the Dutch Royal Shell in a climate case recently. So there's a real growing movement for these sort of cases, and we see a real opportunity to win this case.
Let's talk about emissions now. Australia, where you are, Norway and Qatar. Those are 3 countries that are quite small in terms of population, but all have vast reserves of oil and gas for export. They're all exporting their emissions. Now, Australia has been quite slow when it comes to acknowledging and implementing changes at home. But Norway, it seems, has made great strides. But despite all this, they're still pushing ahead with drilling in the Arctic. Why do you think this is?
Well, there's a lot of money to be made in oil, and what we need to do is have people stand up for people and planet. And we really need to have a holistic approach to climate change, which encompasses all elements. So it's not good enough for a government or a company to be doing one thing on one side and then another thing on the other side. We see this with Australia as well, with extreme amounts of exports. And that's why this case is so important. We need people to be out there calling out the greenwashing. Australia exports a lot more fossil fuels than it produces itself. And so we need cases like this to hold governments and companies accountable for what they're actually doing. And we know if we're to keep within a safe climate, we need to keep the oil in the soil. And that's why this case is so important.
Now, Sam, back in 2018, the Norwegian government, after a significant amount of pressure, announced that the Arctic Lofoten Islands will be protected for oil drilling for 4 years. Now, that time is nearly up. Do you think there'll be more pushback?
I think we always face pushback, and we're always there willing and ready to fight. We've done a lot of solidarity actions with Friends of the Earth Norway, and this is a really important case. People love the Arctic, and they're going to fight for it. This has been a massive global campaign, and we're hopeful to win in the courts, and there'll be significant global pressure on the Norwegian government around this issue at the upcoming climate negotiations and into the future.
Okay, great to get your thoughts. Thank you so much for joining us on Counting the Cost. Sam Cossar-Gilbert, campaigner at Friends of the Earth International. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
The leisure and hospitality sectors have been hit hardest by the pandemic. According to the World Travel and Tourism Council, the industry suffered a loss of almost $4.5 trillion in 2020. In 2019, the travel and tourism sector contributed 10% to global GDP, a share which decreased to 5.5% in 2020, due, of course, to the ongoing restrictions to mobility. Now, in 2020, 62 million jobs were lost, representing a drop of 18.5%, leaving just 272 million people employed across the sector globally. That's compared to 334 million in 2019. Well, you can see why governments are desperate to get people back into work and get the economy motoring. Well, one island nation that is opening its borders to travellers and visitors is Mauritius. In the years prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, Mauritius welcomed up to 1.4 million visitors annually, with tourism accounting for approximately 25% of GDP. Well, let's find out how they're going to reopen the economy to international tourism. Joining me now via Skype from Port Louis is Arvind Bundhun, Director of the Mauritius Tourism Promotion Authority. Great to have you with us on Accounting the Cost. Just start us off by explaining how you're preparing for this influx of tourists.
We are opening in two phases. Phase one, which is from July to September, whereby we are opening with a resort bubble. And as from October, we will open the island subject to vaccinated passengers undergoing PCR tests, and then there won't be any quarantine, or then passengers can just enjoy the facilities of the island.
Tell us about the resort bubble. How will this work? Will tourists be restricted to the individual resorts, or will they eventually be allowed to explore the rest of the island?
Actually, the resort bubble will allow us to welcome tourists in 14 world-class resorts, and the tourists or the visitors will have access to all the facilities of the hotel, be it refined cuisine, be it the beach, be it our lagoons. And after 14 days, then they can venture out in the community and visit all the places. Basically, with the resort bubble, we want to promote our legendary service in exclusive resorts.
Marvellous. Now, tourism accounts for 25% of GDP. The last year has been very difficult, of course, all around the world. But just explain to us the impact that this has had on people who work in the industry.
Tourism was at a halt during the past 1.5 years throughout the world. However, the government has taken very courageous measures and have been extremely bold in supporting with various schemes. And the first scheme was to support employment. And fortunately, with this clever management of the pandemic of COVID-19, we are today announcing that we are open and in a safe and secured manner. Today, Mauritius opens as a motto: safety is the new luxury.
OK. It's very interesting the government has this support scheme, but the government of Mauritius is also pushing for the production of vaccines on Mauritian soil. Tell us more about this initiative.
Actually, this has been a bold measure announced by the Minister of Finance. And I would like to place on record that Mauritius is a vibrant economy. It's a diversified economy. And today, actually, with the pandemic, we've seen that getting vaccines is quite challenging. So I would say this is a decision that would be able to invite investors to come to Mauritius, invest in these plants. And this could be also beneficial for all our region.
Great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us. That's Arvind Bundhun, Director of the Mauritius Tourism Promotion Authority. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is our show for this week, but there's lots more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has entire episodes for you to catch up on. I'm Hala Mohieddin from the Counting the Cost team. Thank you for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.